Norman ventured deeper into the bowels of the Lacroix building. He knew instinctively that it was not a place that men like him should tread. It was the muffled cry for help that beckoned him, but the lower he went, the more he began to rethink his decision. On top of the steadily rising plea for help, other voices announced themselves. The walls were white and sterile still, but the lights had become fleeting and far between. Before long, Norman found himself jumping from islands of light through oceans of darkness, perhaps being guided by sirens to dash him onto the rocks. "Hello? Is anyone there? I can't do this. Just let me go. I can't do it anymore." The voice reached out into the ether for anyone to reply. That was the voice that Norman focused on, though there was a cacophony of other voices all speaking at once. They didn't appear to be speaking to one another, but all in private conversations that only managed to make a hush whisper of gentle noise. Norman felt as if the walls were swelling and contracting, as if he were in the belly of a sleeping beast. But if that were the case, that would mean it didn't matter where he went. He was already f***ed. The lights went completely away for a time, and Norman walked down a hallway of nothingness. He pulled his cell phone and let its light become a lantern in the darkness, even though he could barely see a foot from his face. All the voices started to become clear, and he could hear tidbits of thoughts and ideas whispered into the void. The man was a talking t-shirt, and it convinces him to kill his wife. So Dan, Sue, and Plato find it wasn't about the quest, but the friends they made along the way. And Roscoe is kicked off the island, but he blows up. He doesn't want to leave. "Hello? Somebody! Help!" said the one voice that was yelling and not speaking in a conversational tone. Norman noticed an eerie blue glow that was brightening a much bigger room ahead. As he approached, he dared to speak up, even though a part of him didn't want to. "I'm coming. Hold on," said Norman loudly. "Are you talking to me?" said the voice. "Yes, I'm coming. Hold on," Norman said again. Slowly, Norman approached. He gasped in horror at what he saw. The room was massive, about the size of a basketball court. In the middle of the room was a dim, flickering blue glow. It felt much like the shade of color that came from a television. That alone might have been chilling on its own, but it was the wires and cables of all sizes that poured out of the massive hole that were connected to people that almost looked to be fused into the walls of the dome-like room. That was worse. The wall was littered with people attached to the wires of this hole. It was hard to tell how they were fused at all. It was as if they were functions of the machine. The eerie blue light shone off their unblinking faces, while each person mumbled words, fragmented ideas of stories that might potentially be content in a confusing word salad. Norman stopped speaking altogether and realized he should have never came. He followed the cries for help amongst the bodies of people in catatonic states of being. Their unblinking eyes followed him as he moved, though none of them stopped their ceaseless chatter that became background noise. "I'm over here," yelled the voice. Norman ran over to the sound. It was a man positioned about 2 bodies up in this living wall. "Can you get me down?" the man cried. He was fused to the wall and fitted with wires crisscrossing throughout his body like mechanical veins. "Sure. How?" Norman said quickly and quietly. "I don't know. Just pull something or something." Norman looked around the dimly lit room for something to stand on, a ladder or crane of some sort. He figured they had to have gotten him up there some sort of way. He didn't see anything, so he had to improvise. He slowly climbed onto the shoulders of a man who was mumbling about a 1960s sitcom about a black girl raised by racists in the South. If Norman had just heard that in the wild, he may have chuckled. Norman's weight on the man's shoulder wasn't an issue, and if it was, the man showed no signs of it. He pushed up higher, crawled onto a woman and found himself level with the man in distress. Norman attempted to pull out a wire in the man's shoulder, but when he did, he howled in pain. "This thing is attached to you?" Norman said in surprise. "I suppose I woke up like this." Norman went into his pocket and pulled a box cutter. Though things had been relatively normal at the job for a few days, he had never stopped bringing the knife with him on the off chance it wasn't. He began sawing at the wires. As he made progress, a black oily liquid oozed out of him, and the pit stirred. Norman had the sinking feeling that something was somehow connected to him, but he couldn't prove it, and he didn't want to. He cut slower and more concisely, somehow making the gentle moaning subside. He sawed at the wires for a while and made slow progress, but at this rate, it may be a few minutes. He whispered to the man he detached. "Why are you up here? I didn't produce enough content for the beast." Norman was terrified to ask him what that meant, so he didn't. "I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what it was. It was just a figure of speech, I thought. It feeds," he babbled. Norman severed all the wires that dripped with the oily black blood. He gently pulled the man from the wall, but he screamed. Patches of his skin were fused to the wall. Norman looked the man in the eye and said, "What do you want me to do, man? I can try to get help." The man teared up. He knew he'd never be back if he left. "Can you?" Norman slowly put the box cutter to the man's back. "I can't do it," Norman said as the man's skin stretched impossibly. What if I do it wrong, man?" "Look, I can't do this anymore. If I get out of this building, I'm out of Furlong and I'm never coming back. In fact, I'm gonna live in a cabin in the woods with no internet or TV. None of it happens if you can't get me out of here." Norman took a deep breath and pressed the box cutter to the fused man's skin.